Over the last 10 years, justice systems around the world have started to use computer algorithms to help judges and parole board members make better decisions about things like bail amounts, to make better decisions about things like sentencing and whether or not someone should get paroled. So here's 2 case studies of that algorithm in action in the Florida justice system. We have Vernon Prater, prior offences, 2 armed robberies and 1 attempted armed robbery. He was picked up for stealing about $100 worth of tools from a Home Depot. The second case study we have is Brisha Borden. Now, Brisha's story is pretty interesting. She and her friends were walking to her sister's school to pick up her sister. They were running a little bit late, and as they walked down the road, they noticed that there was a front yard with a little Razor scooter and a little kid's bicycle, and they decided, well, we might take those, in a very ill-conceived decision, and use that to get us to the school quicker. Well, they took them, and they quickly realized that they were sized for a 6-year-old, so they dropped them. About that time, the mother burst out the front door of their house, chased these 2 down the road. A neighbour was watching the whole thing, called the police. About half an hour later, Borden was being charged with petty theft and burglary. So here's where things start to get kind of strange. If you think about Prater and you think about Borden, who do you think poses the greatest risk to society of reoffending? Well, the interesting thing is the algorithm decided that Vernon Prater was a low risk of reoffending. They rated him about 3 out of 10 as a risk for offending. The algorithm also decided that Brisha Borden was a very high risk of reoffending, even though she'd had only a few minor misdemeanors as a kid and, given the severity of her crime. She was rated 8 out of 10. So that is kind of strange, and when you start to think through and understand what the reasons are behind those ratings, it actually becomes quite concerning because you've got to pull back from those 2 case studies and look at the application of the algorithm in the justice system more generally. Research was done which showed that for similar crimes, black people were rated more highly as a risk of reoffending, even though typically they would have a lower reoffending rate in the future. White people, it was skewed towards a lower risk rating for reoffending, even those who would reoffend in the future. To put it simply, the algorithm was making racist decisions about reoffending risk. That is scary, but that's actually not the scariest part of the story. The scariest part of the story is that the design of how algorithms and people like judges and parole boards interact with each other typically isn't all that good, to be honest. So just put yourself in the position of a human being, a judge or a parole board member. They have got a piece of paper in front of them that says, this person is a high risk of reoffending. And that piece of paper has been generated by a big, expensive computer system. Do you think that they're going to go against that recommendation? It's kind of human nature to think they probably won't, right? Because from a personal risk perspective, going against it, if the person reoffends, well, that doesn't reflect particularly well on them. We are entering a new, a very different world of design at the moment. Now, unless you have been living the life of a hermit for the last 2 decades or so, you and everybody you know have been leaving a wide trail of data and information. Information like your likes, your dislikes, your personal preferences, your medical history, your financial history, your dating history, your interactions with family, friends, colleagues, your relationship with the law. And all of this data is being held by organizations, businesses, government, and they are processing it and using it to generate insights and draw conclusions and decisions about you in your absence. I'm probably making this sound a bit more sinister than I want it to be. This is actually a good thing. And the reason it's a good thing is because the more people who are designing things for you know about you, the better they can be at their jobs. The more convenient, the more high impact in your life, the more personalized what they're designing can be, to the point where it's going to feel so good, it's actually going to feel kind of creepy. We're entering an age of emerging artificial intelligences. programs that are smart enough that they can do activities that previously were the domain of human beings only. And so artificial intelligences today can do things like drive cars. They can have a meaningful conversation with you. Artificial intelligences can compose Irish fiddle music that is at least as good as most Irish fiddlers can compose on their own. And artificial intelligences can make predictions about important topics like whether or not you're an ABBA fan, or maybe whether or not you are going to get your tax bill in on time, or maybe whether or not you're going to develop heart disease in your late 40s and early 50s. And this, again, is really exciting for designers because artificial intelligences can make sense of all that big data and use it to generate insights that can genuinely help people. So it really is an exciting time. We're in an age of connection. We have never been more connected than we are today. We're connected to people and technologies around the world 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, every day of the year. We are connected by devices that fit into our pocket, and they're devices that are so meaningful to us that, that when they go out of charge, we start to feel anxious. And all of these technological innovations, data innovations, the connectivity, the processing power that's available, is driving designers who are thinking about those big problems of society to design in new ways, to take up completely different models, things that weren't even conceivable, even 10 years ago. And then there's you, the consumer, the beneficiary, the target. What does it mean to live in a world where people have access to a lot of information about you and are designing things to make your life better? In a world where these designs are changing in subtle ways the way you live day to day, year to year. I'm Darren Menachemson. I'm one of the partners of a public good consultancy called ThinkPlace. We work around the world in developed and developing countries. And we work on a lot of very interesting projects, often projects that lie at the intersection of the policy world, of the technology world, and of the world of human experience and communities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our work, but before I do that, I want to talk about this. This is a picture of my blood. It's been drawn in a malaria screen in a hospital in Nairobi in Kenya. And if you sort of cycle back about 3 hours, I just landed in Nairobi, coming from a piece of work I was doing in Tanzania. Landed, got in a cab, and then over the next 2 hours or so, the cab worked its slow way through the incredible traffic that anyone who's been to Nairobi would have experienced. And over the course of those 2 hours, I started to get sick. Really sick. I was sick to the point that when I reached the hotel, I got out the car, got about halfway across the lobby, and then I fell over. And 2 burly guards picked me up, put me on a bench, asked if I was okay. I can't remember my answer, but whatever it was, I was then picked up by the 2 burly guards and put back in my cab, and now I was on my way to a hospital in Nairobi. And I thought, this is fantastic. Because what a fantastic opportunity to experience the Nairobi private hospital system. And so I decided that I was going to become kind of my own ethnographic researcher. I had a fully loaded phone, and I decided I was going to take some photos and really try to express in a visual way what it was like to be sick in Nairobi as a foreigner. So this is one of those photos. Here's another one. Those are my 2 doctors. One of them just couldn't understand why I kept on asking if I could take photographs of everything. The other one was laughing at me because he thought that I was the most dedicated Facebook user on the African continent. And you can see that the camera work isn't particularly good because at that point my temperature would have been approaching about 40 degrees. But you know, over the 24 hours that I was in that hospital, as this thing that started so quickly kind of burned through my system, and then literally suddenly was gone, and they still don't know what it was. I had a pretty good hospital experience. My entry, the triage process, the treatment that I got, the meds that arrived with the right dosage, arriving at the right time to the right person, my discharge, the sage advice that my brilliant doctors gave me as I left the hospital, it was all a very smooth experience. I mean, sure, there were some irritating moments where you had to fill in the same form a couple of times, but overall, pretty good. I want to talk about a different type of hospital experience, and this one happens in Congo. It was told to me by a friend of mine from Germany who worked there for a little while. She told me a story. A woman, 7 months pregnant, starts to feel a pain in her abdomen. And after a little while, she decides that she's got to go to the doctor. So she uses a combination of walking and hitchhiking over the course of a day to go from her village to this hospital. She gets checked in. The triage nurse takes a whole lot of her information and writes it down on a clipboard and a piece of paper. And then that triage nurse and that piece of paper disappear from our story. And they're never seen again. The information was lost. Anyway, she sits for 5 or 6 or 7 hours until finally she gets to see a doctor. And the doctor has been on shift for a long time. He's a foreigner. He's wearing a white jacket, looking very formal and authoritative and quite intimidating. He's tired, he's very brisk, and she's quite intimidated by every one of those factors I mentioned. So she kind of minimizes her symptoms because she doesn't want to cause too much of a fuss. And the doctor doesn't pick this up because he's tired. And ultimately, long story short, she leaves the hospital a few minutes later with some very minor pain relief. And the next day she's back, and this time she gets intercepted by my German doctor friends. And at this point, a health issue which could have been intercepted the day before was suddenly much more serious and putting the life of the woman and her child in jeopardy. Something broke, but we can't find the crack. How did that type of scenario happen? Well, I'll tell you one thing. If you look at the clinical data and the administrative data that the hospital collects, you won't find the answer to why that happened. You may find some indication that there's a problem, but you won't find the reason. To find the reason, you have to get underneath the data. You have to be in the ward. You have to be seeing not just those obvious things like the lost information at the triage point, but the power dynamics or the power disparities between the patient and the doctor, and the cultural disparities between the patient and the doctor, and how these things start to build up to those types of events. In short, you have to be there in person, looking at the human behavior and taking an empathetic understanding of what's going on before you can have a hope of solving something like that. We do a lot of work with communities and cohorts who are facing multiple challenges in their life. And often, when we do those types of projects, we'll have a quote that sounds a little bit like this: if I just had some goddamn shelving. Why is that important? Well, this type of quote and these types of words will often come from people who are having lots of multiple challenges all at once in their life. They're overwhelmed, they're stressed. They're navigating systems where multiple government agencies and multiple community organizations are saying, register with that program, go see that counselor, use this service, everyone trying to fix the person and their family. And meanwhile, they might be suffering from depression, they might be stressed, they might be completely overwhelmed. Another quote was, everyone's asking me to do all this type of stuff, but it actually takes me 3 hours just to get the motivation to get off the couch. And the reason for that was because the house was so messy, and it just was a huge inhibitor to actually taking the next step. It sounds simple, right? But this was a real issue. And if she could just get some goddamn shelving, that would just allow her to start on the process. But she didn't have enough money to buy shelving. And if she had enough money, she didn't have a car or any way to get it to a house. And if she hadn't gotten it to a house, she couldn't hire a contractor to put them up. And she didn't have the skills. And so how do you come to a conclusion that what's needed maybe isn't another program or another service interaction? Instead, it's just some goddamn shelving. His death at 52 became inevitable 11 months after he was born. And the design of cities is something, again, that's another order of complexity. Cities can be designed in a way that can make for very unhealthy lives for people. Design a city with the wrong amount of shade, you'll see a spike in melanoma. Design a city with the wrong amount of of healthy activity available, and you'll see a spike in issues like heart disease. And yet, just like the shelving, just like the hospital scenario, unless you can get underneath the data and understand how people are living their lives, create a very empathetic understanding of how people engage with their city, you can't design a solution to that that is going to be sustainable and meaningful. You can't take a city from where it is and take it over a couple of decades to where it needs to be. All of these things require something different, and it's something that's beneath all of these technologies that are so seductive to design today. This is a quote that I quite like. You may have heard the world is made up of atoms and molecules, but it's rarely made up of stories. When you sit with an individual that's been here, you can give quantitative data a qualitative overlay. And we've had all of these revolutions that I talked about, all of these emerging technologies that are changing our lives. But associated with that, we also need an empathy revolution. Because empathy is all about that, as I've said, just getting underneath the data, connecting to the people that you're designing for and making sure that the difference you make in their lives doesn't suffer from unintended consequences. Empathy is how you make sure that the Brisha Bordens of the world don't get an overly harsh sentence, and how you make sure that the Praters of the world get the right sentence. You get into the living room of the people you're trying to help. You get into the hospital ward. You get into the parole board hearing. And in doing so, you start to understand, what does it mean that somebody is being helped, that they're being understood, that they're feeling in control. You start to get their story resonating in your head every time you take a design decision, and that is very powerful. We are entering a new age of design, and there's a lot of powerful and seductive technologies that are being used, and I just want to stress, it's really powerful. They're going to help us make breakthroughs in areas which have been so intractable that human history has not come up with a solution, and maybe now we can start to think some of that through. But you know, saying, but we've got to do it with empathy, isn't kind of as catchy as Save the Whales or Go Green. It's not a campaign slogan that is necessarily going to be very catchy. But if we can inject empathy into the way we're shaping the world, as community and also as designers, and see it as an ethical and a moral imperative, we're going to shape a world that is going to be much more positive in terms of the impact it has on your lives, the lives of your family and community, and society as a whole. And I think that's something worth pushing for.